Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michael Muller. I'm the Director General here at the United Nations office at Geneva. I was a very good friend of Sergio Vieira de Mello and many of the 21 colleagues who died with him on the 19th of August 2003 in Baghdad. They were some of the most committed and talented servants of the international community. So this is a particularly poignant moment for me and for many of my colleagues in this room who worked with and were close to our fallen comrades. My ties to them were strong then, as they are today, and I am particularly pleased to be able to host this commemorative event here at the Palais des Nations today. Thank you for joining us in paying tribute to all of them. Sergio embodied the qualities of a great leader in a world in turmoil, compassionate and decisive, and with a deep understanding of the sense of injustice and of the inequalities that drive conflict and instability. In a world where the humanitarian needs have never been greater, we need those qualities more than ever. Sergio's career, his values, and his deep-seated belief in the United Nations is a good starting point for this discussion. And nobody is better placed to lead the reflection than my colleagues here with me tonight. Systemic abuses of human rights are all too often at the origins of the conflicts we witness across the world today. And the unacceptably high number of refugees and displaced persons are the consequence. From their different vantage points, the two High Commissioners will give their views on how we can get better leadership to address this human suffering much more effectively. And it is a privilege that it will all be woven together by Christiane Amanpour, who has reported from so many of these humanitarian emergencies, making sure that the women, men and children who are caught up in them are not forgotten. Before we start, let me hand over to Anne Willem Bijleveld, who is chairman of the board of the Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation, another friend and tireless advocate for the causes that Sergio believed in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Director General, for your kind words. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. As chairman of the board of the Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation, and on behalf of Director Burin of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, partners for our annual conference, I wish you all a very warm welcome. Sergio's passionate goal was to bring about dialogue and reconciliation between parties in conflict. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us three eminent persons who closely followed Sergio's exceptional work, be it with the UNHCR, on special missions for the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, or as High Commissioner for Human Rights. They are Mr. António Guterres, former Prime Minister of Portugal and High Commissioner for Refugees for nearly 10 years. Mr. Zeid Hussein, who played a crucial role in setting up the International Criminal Court, served as President of the Security Council and became High Commissioner for Human Rights 6 months ago. And last but not least, we have with us Christiane Amanpour, our moderator and CNN's chief international correspondent, who is well known to those of you who actively follow international affairs. Before handing over to Christiane for the debate, Leadership Challenges in a World in Turmoil, I would like to inform you about certain aspects of tonight's event. Since CNN will broadcast part of this evening's debate on the Amanpour Show tonight at 8 p.m. on CNN International, Christiane will now reopen our event for the sake of her TV viewers. She will announce a break for ads once, and after roughly 25 minutes she will close her show, but continue to moderate our debate for another hour. There will also be a possibility for questions and answers from the audience. In line with Sergio's love of teaching and communicating with young academics, questions from students will be given priority. The event will be closed by Vieira de Mello, Sergio's older son and president of our foundation. Christiane, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to say how incredibly thrilled I am to be here tonight. I pay tribute to the sons and to the widow of Sergio Vieira de Mello. I spent a lot of my career covering the places that he was sent as special UN envoy, whether it was the Balkans, whether it was Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, many of those places where he worked so hard to bring peace and to end the suffering of ordinary civilians. So it's a great honor for me to be here. And thank you all for letting me put some of this on CNN. And as you heard, the first part will be more in the shape of an interview, and then we'll open it up to questions and debates. So here we go. Thank you very much indeed. António Guterres, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Zeid Al-Hussein, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, thank you for joining me. Good to have you tonight. Let me ask you straight away. The world is flooded with refugees. The Syria war has simply made this front and center of really our agenda right now. There's been a lot of criticism about how the world has simply failed Syria. What would you say to that kind of criticism?
Well, for me it's very simple. We lived in a unipolar world. Before, in a bipolar world, there was not a global governance system, but there were clear power relations. Today we live in a world that is no longer unipolar or bipolar. It's also not multipolar, it's chaotic. Unpredictability and impunity became the name of the game. Anybody can start a crisis anywhere, not being afraid of anything. Security Council is essentially paralyzed in the key issues that we are facing, be it in Syria or in many other situations. And the result is obvious. Conflicts multiply, old conflicts are not solved, and the number of people displaced is increasing in a dramatic way, and the number of victims of all kinds is increasing in a dramatic way.
Just to be clear, I believe the number is 51 million refugees around the world today. Is that correct?
Between refugees that cross borders and people that are displaced within the borders of their own country, and normally worst, because sometimes their own government is part of the problem and not part of the solution, you have today, for the first time since the Second World War, more than 50 million people.
And with those more than 50 million people come the most unbelievable and whole-scale violation of human rights. Right now, as we're speaking, there are appalling pictures from the dungeons of the Syrian prisons, of Bashar Assad's prisons, being exhibited in the halls of the United Nations in New York. This was a story that I actually broke a year ago. Are you even able to address the issue of human rights in some of these countries, but especially during war and conflict?
Make no mistake, Christiane, there will be justice done to the victims. Just look at the trial soon to take place of the former president of Chad. Habré will go on trial very soon in Senegal for alleged crimes committed 30 years ago. Today I met, for instance, with the Commission of Inquiry on Syria. We have a massive amount of evidence. There are lists with people's names on them, and justice will be done. It may not be immediate, and not in every case will we see perpetrators brought, but we are hopeful that as we go through this transition from total impunity to justice being realized, we will honor the victims and the kin of the victims.
Mr. Gutierrez, people generally are generous. Governments who don't do enough to stop a war often empty their pockets to help the victims, the refugees. And yet, this year, 2014, we've seen a dramatic fall-off in government commitments to help refugees in Syria and elsewhere, but particularly in Syria. As the crisis gets worse, the attention seems to get less. The amount of money, the amount of help seems to get less. How do you explain that?
To be honest, there is not less money. The humanitarian support has been even increasing. The problem is that the needs are growing in a much faster pace. Just to give you 3 figures, 2011, the number of people displaced by conflict per day, 14,000. 2012, 23,000. 2013, 32,000. So the needs of the people are increasing exponentially, and the support that is provided increases but at a much slower pace. And so all the humanitarian appeals around the world are dramatically underfunded. The average, around 50% of the needs are covered, which means that 50% of very basic things linked to core protection, to life-saving, 50% of the things that should be done are not done.
And take the Syria case, as we stay with Syria, the fact that ISIS has come on the scene, does that hinder your work even more than it was hindered before?
There are 2 kinds of problems. One is resources, the other is access. Obviously, when we deal with refugees outside the country, we have no access problems. There the only limitation is resources. But when we deal inside the country of conflict, the questions of access become paramount, and both in Syria and Iraq we have today dramatic problems of access in different areas of the country, and of course the emergence of ISIS just made it even worse, even more problematic.
This report that came out today, a group of human rights organizations and other organizations around the world, I'm sorry, but they had very shocking comments. They said the state of Syria, the human rights violations, the fact that the people are still being slaughtered, we're entering the 5th year of war, is a stain on the international community's conscience. How do you react to that, and how are you measuring the level of abuse now in Syria because of ISIS as the added violator of human rights?
Well, I mean, clearly wickedness has almost been redefined in Syria and Iraq. Never before has it been so visible, actual executions being presented in the most intimate detail almost for the viewer. And it's beyond expression almost in trying to capture how appalling these images are. We have constant monitoring of the situation. As I said, there's a fact-finding mission, or rather a commission of inquiry in Syria that's been now working there for 4 years, working around the region. And then we have a fact-finding mission in Iraq, which will submit its report very soon, and also detailing, chronicling the crimes having been committed. As I said before, we have now transitioned into a world where there will be less and less impunity. And I'm absolutely sure that at some stage the evidence will find its way into prosecutors who are able to prosecute at least the worst offenders of these crimes.
You know, while we're waiting to do that, while we're waiting for the long game to maybe one day bring these people to justice, how do we convince, as some have asked, the people in Syria who believe that the world has forgotten and abandoned them, that we still are committed to human rights, their human rights?
It is very difficult. I served on the UN Security Council last year in my previous capacity, and the sense of frustration, I think, on the part of all members in terms of the inability to arrest this descent into a bloodbath as a crisis emerges is very palpable. And of course the victims are going to feel let down, and we can feel the failure, the collective failure, as we see the stories day by day on the television screens. Who wouldn't feel very frustrated? But be that as it may, it doesn't mean we stop. We have to remain committed to try and put this war to an end. And it has happened in the past. We should never say never in this regard.
And yet, and I speak to you not just as High Commissioner for Refugees, but as a former Prime Minister and politician who's had to deal with this. We're sitting in Geneva, where the so-called Geneva peace process for Syria was meant to have taken hold, and it hasn't. And for more than a year now, nothing has happened in the peace domain. Given the fact that these whole-scale refugee crises or human rights crises generally happen in conflict and war, do you think that somebody such as yourself, the High Commissioner for Refugees, or somebody such as yourself for human rights, should be at the peace table as well, should have a role in trying to negotiate the peace? I mean, let's face it, the UN Security Council has been given an F grade. The politicians have been given a failing grade over Syria.
I think that here we have a serious problem of lack of leadership and convening power. There is a number of countries that has a direct influence in what's happening in Syria today. The two parties would not be able to fight without the strong support they receive in money and arms from the outside. And there is a group of countries that is key in relation to what's happening today in Syria. And these countries today, they are all losing. Nobody is winning. This is a war that is causing trouble to everybody. It's a war that has completely destabilized the region. Look at Iraq. It's a war that became a global threat to peace and security. So I do believe that there is a common interest in stopping this war. The question is, there is nobody in the world with the convening power able to bring these 5 or 6 countries together and say to them, let's get together, let's forget our contradictions, let's stop this nonsense.
On that note, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the challenges that both of you face around the world. But first, all right. Okay. Now we're coming back. They get a pass grade. Okay, give me 10 seconds.
This would be the funny part to be broadcasted.
Yes, the clapping won't be broadcast. Okay. Yep. Okie dokie. Here we go, guys. Welcome back to the program, where we continue our conversation with the UN. Let me do that again. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the program, where we continue our conversation on the challenges of leadership in this world of increasing turmoil. And I'm joined by the UN Commissioner for... Why do I keep getting that wrong? Now you see how it's really done. Okay, sure. Welcome back to the program, where we continue our discussion about the challenges of leadership in our world in turmoil. And I'm joined once again by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, António Guterres, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid al-Hussein. Beyond Syria, it's not just the region that's affected by the overflow and the refugees, it's here in Europe as well. All we have to do is look at these tragic boatloads of people who force their ways into these unseaworthy vessels, and more often than not, many of them die trying to reach freedom. The EU has, it has been said, well, the EU has put its own sort of Triton experience to try to save these people, and Italy has stopped what was quite a successful operation to try to save these people. It was called Mare Nostrum. It's been said that the EU should place valuing human rights and people's lives back at the top of their agenda. Is that a fair criticism of the EU and how it's tackling what's happening in front of our eyes in the seas off Italy?
Well, this is something that I have to be very emotional about it, because it really breaks my heart that a Syrian family that has seen their house destroyed, that has seen members of the family being killed, has to risk their lives again, putting themselves in the hands of smugglers and traffickers that are horrible violators of human rights, to perish in the Mediterranean just to get to Europe. And the Mare Nostrum was a very successful operation, but the Triton does not replace Mare Nostrum. The Triton is not conceived to rescue lives. The Triton was conceived to protect European borders. And what we need is a strong, a robust rescue at sea operation in the Central Mediterranean, and I believe it's the EU responsibility to put it in place. What we have now is not doing the job. And the idea that the Mare Nostrum was attracting people. Look, today we have 43% more crossings in January and February than in January and February last year with the Mare Nostrum. People are not moving because of, or not moving because of the Mare Nostrum. People were moving because they were desperate. And they looked at Europe as the only place where they would find safety.
Now, you know, the Italian government has said that refugees or immigrants who want to come over should be processed in camps in those countries where they come from. I don't know, Libya, where? Does that make any sense to you?
I think that for the moment what is important is to, first of all, save lives. Second, it is important, of course, to fight smuggling and trafficking. It is important to address root causes whenever possible. But in some conditions, if we could offer the possibility to people to have a center where they could receive asylum from a European country without having to cross the Mediterranean in these tragic circumstances, of course that could be a good idea. But then we would need to make sure that first, all rights would be respected. Second, that this would be not a prison or a jail, but it would be a free center. Third, that all those that would be found in need of protection would be received in Europe. So I think that for the moment what would be important would be to give more visa flexible have more visa-flexible policies and admit more people through these regular channels, would be to have more family reunification programs, more resettlement and humanitarian admission opportunities. And I have to say there are 2 European countries that are doing it and are doing it quite well, Germany and Sweden. What we need is all European countries to follow their example.
Well, all European countries, or a lot of them anyway, are faced with this very unsettling rise of xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant parties, which have done well in European elections and threaten to do well in national elections in some of our countries. How worried are you, as Human Rights Commissioner, about that eventuality?
Well, I think the exploitation by populist leaders in various countries of this issue is shameful, and it really has to stop. One need only recall that across the lake from where we're sitting in 1938, before the Holocaust came into being, Hitler wanted to and was proposing deporting the Jewish population out of Germany. There was a meeting in Evian in 1938, and the countries attending all refused to accept any movement of Jewry into their countries. Some saying that they didn't want to import a racial problem. And of course then the Holocaust followed. I think we have to be mindful of history. We have to be mindful of exploiting these poor people, as Antonio said, who've lost everything in many cases, and view them as if they're not human, as if they don't have the rights that we all have. And so I hope that movements that exploit the presence of migrants and others who are vulnerable will take a deeper breath and think about what it is that they're doing. We cannot replay scenes from the 20th century. No longer do we find this acceptable.
Let's go all the way across the sea again to Saudi Arabia, a country which has been criticized loudly by many, many people for its violations of human rights against women, against bloggers. Can you even get through to Saudi Arabia? Do you even have a dialogue that amounts to a real dialogue about human rights there?
Well, it's a good question. Yes, we have a dialogue. And you can look at the absolute condition and say that there's so many things that need redress, absolutely. We can also look at changes in terms of trajectory that are encouraging. You know, these are early changes. When one considers women's rights, for instance, 100 years ago, women suffered abominably everywhere around the world, and throughout the 20th century, and now we see these patterns changing very quickly. In Saudi Arabia, we see women beginning businesses, becoming business leaders in very narrow sections of society. And when we have a workshop on human rights, they participate actively. So the changes within the country are detectable. They may be few, but they're detectable. And just as we should be outspoken when it comes to gross violations, we need to encourage those changes from within so that they take place.
molasses, some people say, in terms of describing change coming to Saudi Arabia in these particular issues, particularly women's rights. Both of you, Palestinians and Israelis, we have just seen yet another war in Gaza. We've had yet more pledges by the international community to rebuild Gaza after parts of it were once again flattened. We understand that almost nothing of the billions of dollars that were pledged has arrived, and almost nothing has been rebuilt. How much of a challenge is that on both issues, on refugees and people, whether they're internally or displaced outwards, and on their human rights?
I think that, first of all, the Palestinian refugees are handled by another agency, by UNRWA, but of course we are all citizens of the world. And
I guess the real question is, in some of these countries like Saudi Arabia, it's quite difficult for the UN to get through some of the human rights issues. In Israel, also it's quite difficult because they criticize you for not being impartial.
But one thing that for me is very clear is that the fact that the Israeli-Palestinian question is not solved is a factor that aggravates many of the other crises we are dealing with. And I think the international community should invest much more into creating the conditions for this problem to be solved. And in many situations where we go, when we criticize aspects related to human rights or to refugee protection that is not effective, an argument that is usually presented to us, but why doesn't it happen in Gaza? So indeed, the capacity of the international community to address and to solve the Palestinian problem is, in my opinion, an essential element for many other crises, not to solve them, because we know that these things have their own dynamics, but at least it would be a positive factor in facilitating the solution of other problems.
And Zeid, your own country suffered a brutal human rights violation, the pilot who was so appallingly murdered. How did you react to that? And what is it that has yet to get a coalition, let's say, of Arab nations to go in and liberate Syria or Iraq?
When I first heard the news, I think, like everyone, I was sickened. Because you believe you've seen everything until they come up and devise a new way of presenting a crime, and of course an abominable crime it is. And I've said this before, Christiane, I cannot for the life of me understand what you gain out of killing a captive, someone defenseless, man, woman or child. There's no legal tradition, religious tradition that supports action like this. There seems to be this almost bloodlust, almost it's pleasurable for them to do this, killing someone defenseless. And where's the courage in that? It's just appalling. So that was the reaction. In terms of how we confront all of this, it is clear when looking back 9 years ago, we were looking at a situation in Iraq which was not too dissimilar, with Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi committing, decapitations and putting them on YouTube. And obviously the strategies that were employed then and continued on for the last 9 years haven't worked. So we need to think radically about how to do this. We need to think in terms of ideas. We need to think in terms of how we untangle the ideology that's at work there, and what makes these young people from around the world flock to participate in this barbarism. It's something we have to decode and decipher.
On that note, High Commissioners, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein and António Guterres.
Thank you.
And when we come back, imagine your world plunged totally into darkness. Okay? Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll have a couple more questions on different issues, and then we'll open it to the floor, because we've got about an hour now, so we can talk a little bit more. So we focused a lot on Syria and touched on a few other things, the European issue and some other things. When you look further afield as Commissioner for Refugees, where do you see the next massive crisis? I mean, I was just reading of a brewing conflict perhaps that's going to spill over from the Philippines. Where are you looking to pre-position for the next crisis?
That is a very difficult question to answer. If one looks at today's world, what we have is a multiplication of new crises. Since the end of 2013, we had South Sudan, Central African Republic, Iraq, the Ukraine, Libya again. So new crises, and Nigeria. And many of them are unpredictable. We could have a problem in Central Asia, we could have a problem in Southwest Asia, we could have a problem in different parts of Africa. We can have a problem in Europe, Armenia, Azerbaijan. The tension has been increasing. So it's impossible to predict where the next crisis will be, but we know that there will be more crises because they are multiplying so quickly. At the same time, we have the mega Syria-Iraq crisis, which is gigantic from the humanitarian point of view. 3.9 million refugees from Syria, 7.6 million displaced inside Syria, 2.5 million displaced inside Iraq. I mean, it's huge. And then you have the old crises that never die. I mean, Afghanistan is there for decades. Somalia is there for decades. DRC is there for decades. So the capacity of the international community to prevent conflict and to solve conflicts has been considerably reduced. Now, where will the next crisis be? To be honest, I don't know. But there are several candidates, and what we have seen, for instance, recently with Nigeria, everybody was saying that this was going to happen, but nothing was done.
You mean in the Boko Haram and that part?
And you had a combination of the political difficulties inside Nigeria that were obvious, and then the emergence of the Boko Haram. And the combination of the two is created today a regional problem. Cameroon is involved, Niger is involved, Chad is involved. We have at the same time, at the same borders, refugees fleeing, military operations taking place from the outside into Nigeria, and the Boko Haram attacking the neighboring countries, which means a nightmare scenario for humanitarians operating there.
You mentioned Afghanistan. A lot of work has been done in Afghanistan on human rights, and certainly on women's rights. And if there's one thing I remember from the fall of the Taliban and the fall of Osama bin Laden, was when women and men came out into the streets to demand rights for everybody, for girls and boys to go to school. So the people wanted it themselves. And yet today, I can pick up the New York Times or any newspaper or go there myself and see that no matter how much money, how much help has been put into women's human rights, for instance, in this case, cultural practices are still so entrenched that even females who've made it to the police force don't dare go in their uniforms. They have to carry them under their burqas because they're too afraid of what might happen to them.
No, it's very true. I still want to know what the next segment is on CNN when you speak of moving into total darkness.
I'll tell you in a minute.
Okay.
You answer my question, I'll answer yours.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, the international community can legislate through the drafting of treaties, governments can put into place policies, money can be invested, and ultimately it could all seem for naught because the culture seems to be so ingrained in one direction or another that how you undo that is seemingly impossible. And yet we know humanity does change. We know people change, and there are reversals. And these reversals can seem to be immutable, that they may not change. The pattern is so fixed. But we know also the development of human history is that eventually it does happen. There are always tugs in a society between conservative influences and those who are progressive. And I can't remember who said this, but for every, they said for every progressive mind, there are 1,000 self-appointed guardians of the past. And so overcoming this is hugely difficult, but it's not impossible, and it requires of us just to keep working at this and ensuring that all people enjoy their inalienable rights, men and women.
Well, to answer your question about where we're going next, satellite pictures have shown the almost total lack of electricity around Syria. 83% of Syria now has got power cuts. Obviously, it's less in Damascus, which is government-controlled, and much more in Aleppo. But these satellite pictures have just showed that, and it reminds me of the satellite pictures from the Korean Peninsula, where you can see North Korea at night in dark, South Korea in a blaze of lights. So this campaign has started to turn the lights back on in Syria. In other words, get peace and end this war. But we have Sergio Vieira de Mello looking at us there, and we have his family here, and we have everybody here who remembers him, knows of him, and this is done in his memory. And to talk about, the challenges of leadership in this increasingly turbulent world, in turmoil. When I first met Sergio, it was in Bosnia, and it was in the 90s. And at that time, the Balkans were considered the biggest threat to the international community, the biggest threat to the credibility of the international system. What would you both say about the credibility of the international system today, given what we've just been talking about? What do we or you have to do more of?
If you look at Sergio, I knew Sergio quite well because of East Timor. He was in UNHCR for much of his life, but unfortunately I was not there. But in East Timor I could fully appreciate his extraordinary qualities. He was a fantastic operator for peace. But you cannot be successful as an operator for peace if conditions are not created for your negotiating capacity to be able to prevail. And in the Balkans we had lots of tragedies, but in the end there was a political will to intervene, there was a political will to solve the problem, and the key partners of the international community got together and created the conditions for operators to solve the problems on the ground. The difficulty we have today, you can send the best possible operator to Syria, but if those that really run the show do not come together to create the conditions for the operator to succeed, the operator will find a wall. And that's what are happening in many of the crises. You have new Sergios coming, probably not as, with the genius capacity that he had, but new Sergios coming, but getting to a situation in which simply they have not the convening power to bring the parties together because the environment doesn't allow for that to happen. And that is a serious problem of leadership in today's world, which has no easy solution. I think we need a multipolar world with strong multilateral organizations. We are far from getting any of the two.
You worked closely with Sergio. You were deployed in the same zones as he was, some of them. What are your memories, and in relation to the theme of this debate?
Well, he was an extraordinary man and someone extremely charismatic, as his family only knows too well, and all his friends who loved him. And his ease of manner, and you knew you were dealing with someone special. I arrived in the former Yugoslavia 2 to 3 months after he did, and I was still very junior, and I was relatively young. And he calls up, and I have him on the phone, and he said, "This is Sergio. Who are you?" And I thought, well, if he's introducing himself by his first name, I'll say the same. I said, "This is Zeid." And I said, "Who are you?" And so he said to me, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "I'm new in the office." He had this magical way about him. And the UN is divided into two sorts of people, and we have many, many dedicated staff members in this audience. And I think they would agree with me. There are real believers in this organization, no matter how much it's battered around and criticized and accused of various things. And they know that the mission is absolutely necessary. And there are those who are very competent at what they do, but may not believe. This is a job, it's a profession, they do it, they collect the pension and go home. Well, Sergio was the champion of the believers. I mean, he really believed in this organization. And he was a very proud Brazilian. But there was one occasion when I saw how dedicated he was. We were looking, I was at the time in 2002 at the end, I was looking for a prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. I was the chair of the governing body. And there was a colleague of Sergio's who had worked in East Timor, a rather brilliant and talented Brazilian lawyer. And his CV was very impressive. So I called up Sergio and I said, what do you think? Now, normally, if you have someone like that and it's a compatriot, you would basically support the compatriot for the position. And Sergio said he is brilliant and he has outstanding qualities, but he's not the right person for this job. And I realized, how at that stage different he was from so many others who would have acted more tribally, if I can say that. And so he was a very special man, and he was a go-to man, and he was an action man, and he endeared a lot of us who were in the field with him at various times to him. It's not that he got everything right, neither did we. He made mistakes, so did we. But there was a magnetism about him and a sense that you could achieve practical results, and it set him apart from many others.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, a sense that you could achieve. I remember when we saw Sergio coming, we figured things are going to get fixed now.
Yeah.
And they generally were. Yeah. The Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who's under quite a lot of pressure because of his immigrant and migration policy, has said, I am sick and tired of being lectured by the United Nations. Who do they think they are?
Yeah, I'm offended. I have only lectured him once, and I'm offended that he's already tired of listening to me. At least
you mean there's a lot more lectures to come?
3 or 4 lectures I can understand the reaction.
But I think there is a paradox in Australia. Australia is a country that receives 180,000 migrants per year. Australia is a country that has a very important resettlement program for refugees, increasing, and probably one of the countries, if not the country, where integration conditions of refugees in the society are better organized by the government, local authorities, and the civil society. If you come to Australia by plane and ask for asylum, you are treated with an asylum system that is perfectly up to date. But if a boat gets around Australia, then it's a totally different approach. I think that there is a kind of a psychological question about, and the truth is that we have indeed a very serious discussion with the Australian government about what happens to people that come by boat, that go into Nauru, into Papua New Guinea, in conditions that are not acceptable and with a lot of suffering. We agree that we should not be promoting smuggling or trafficking. We agree that things need to be done to fight smuggling or trafficking. We agree that international cooperation is essential, but at the same time Australia needs to be able to assume its responsibilities as an asylum country, also in relation to people that come by boat. So it's a very difficult discussion in the Australia environment because, as I said, whenever anything floats, it's a big problem.
It's very weird, this floating thing. I mean, we've got these tragedies in the Mediterranean, around Australia. I mean, it is strange that. It is strange.
But in Europe, there is, and UNHCR was involved as amicus curiae, there is an historic decision of the European Court on Human Rights that does not allow European countries to push back boats, which means a boat that comes into Europe, the people asking for asylum has the right to disembark and request asylum. And if you remember, there were the pushbacks some years ago in relation to boats being sent back to Libya. So today, this in Europe is not possible thanks to this historical decision of the European Court on Human Rights. Unfortunately, it only applies to Europe.
Yeah, can I answer that, Christiane, as well? Because Australia is a very important country, and it's an important country in the international community. Again, Australia was on the Security Council for the last 2 years, and it played a very active role on certain issues. In Syria, humanitarian access, for instance, it was key to doing this. I think, and when we sit with our Australian colleagues, they put forward strong legal arguments why they are not violating international law. However, it's not a question of whether it's legal or not. It's a question of whether this action is humane. And I think this is what we need to address. These people are not hordes of people coming over, just queue jump prison. These are people who've gone through enough, as Antonio said, and they need to be treated with the dignity they deserve. And I hope that in response to Juan Mendes, who is a very serious person, serious scholar, who himself was tortured, when he asked the Australian government for responses to the questions he posed on whether what is the equivalent or torture has actually occurred, he deserves a serious response and not a slapdown. And so I hope the Australian government reviews its attitude toward the Special Rapporteur.
And do you take a position on the Australians who are sentenced to death in Indonesia on charges of, well, they're convicted of drug trafficking?
Well, on the death penalty, the international community has clearly seen a trend toward adopting moratoria or abolishing the death penalty. And in many cases, we see this trend continue. There have been some regression, however, and most notably Indonesia, Pakistan, and my own country in Jordan. And we have a principled position against the continuation of the use of this penalty when practically no judiciary is mistake-free. And make no mistake about it. When someone is put to death as a result of a miscarriage of justice, the state becomes the killer. The state becomes the killer. The other point is that most of the people executed around the world are poor people. It's as if to say that wealthy, well-connected people do not commit capital crimes. And of course, thirdly, is that it doesn't affect the crime rate in any measurable way. And so we don't find the grounds for the continuation, and at the very least, there should be a suspension of it.
Do you have the same conversation with the United States of America?
Yes, we have a very serious conversation with the United States on all issues. And they listen very carefully. But we do raise this, and we have some advocates, most notably Bill Richardson, who was the former governor of New Mexico, who is now a very vocal, absolutely, former UN ambassador, very vocal advocate of suspending the death penalty.
I'm not sure at what point I'm meant to be asking the questioners to come forward. Anytime I want, I'm told. Where are the young people, the students who want to ask questions? And I'm told you can only ask questions from the front of the room. Any amount of waving and hand-holding from the back, I won't be able to get to you, because they're mics towards the front. So maybe, who's dealing with the mics? Is there a formal question and answer? Somebody tell me? Oh, you're all mic'd. Okay, you're all mic'd. Sorry. Duh. Okay. Who would like to ask a first question? I saw one hand over there. Yes, I saw your hand. You gentleman on the edge there. Yep. And can I please take this opportunity to say, we want questions, not speeches.
But I think he's allowed to say he disagrees with us.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, both your excellencies, for being here with us.
No excellencies.
I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Hussein. I'm from the Geneva School of Diplomacy. I also happen to be the student body president there. And my question goes to the High Commissioner on Human Rights regarding the suspension of the death penalty. You've mentioned that usually the people who are subjected to the death penalty are usually from poor classes. How do you comment on the recent defense of the Australian government for the two people who were in the coke and drugs distribution between Taiwan and Thailand? How do you comment on that? Should they be subjected to the death penalty, or should the law take its course? Thank you.
Is this the same thing we just talked about?
Well, it's a good question. Yes, it's the same question. I mean, again, I think so long as judiciaries are fallible, so long as mistakes can be made, then this penalty needs to be suspended, because we just simply cannot afford to be killing or executing people who are innocent. And I think it was Portugal that was the first country to do away with the death penalty. I can't remember when. Were you
Somewhere
the Prime
in the
Minister?
19th century. No, it was sometime in the 19th century.
Before your time. Okay. Let's get another question. You over there, madam? Yes? Let's have your mic on, please.
My name is Charity Shekari. I'm from Nigeria. My question is to the human rights. There is a genocide that is going on in Nigeria quietly in the Middle Belt, and over 3,000 people have been killed between August 2014 and now. And these people are fleeing their lands and homes, and they're going into the urban areas and becoming internally displaced. They are mostly being attacked by supposed militia or Fulani marauders, not Boko Haram. And these people are all generally in the Middle Belt.
What's the question, ma'am? The question.
The question I'm asking here, is the international community aware of this genocide that is going on in my country? Because there has nothing been said about it.
No, you ask a very good... You ask, can I respond?
Mm-hmm.
Do I need to wait for you to...
No.
No, the question was asked to you.
I know, maybe you should ask.
You, because there's displacement as well.
Okay. No. You ask a very good question, because the dangers we see in many crises is that the sort of emerging black holes where no information seems to be emerging from particularly acute corners of crises. And that we need reporting, we need access to the information is absolutely supreme in terms of its primacy. And we do know, of course, that in most conflicts it's not always clear-cut that only one side is committing allegedly crimes of a severe nature and other sides are not. It's usually much more messy than we think it is. But the point you raise is that we need to have eyes and we need to have reporting. And yes, if the reporting can be verified, then certainly we are not inhibited. We are the opposite. We are uninhibited and we speak out. Yeah.
I just would like to say that Nigeria is probably the most obvious example of the lack of present capacity of the international community to prevent a crisis that people see emerging. And indeed, I mean, you mentioned one series of events. There are other series of events that could be mentioned. It was obvious that things were getting more and more complex, more and more difficult, that violence was emerging, people were being displaced. We have now 1.5 million people displaced inside Nigeria. 1.5 million.
And an example of that because what? The country doesn't have the resources, the world isn't interested?
Because there is no initiative, people are afraid to eventually take any initiative. Regional organizations are sometimes also not able to immediately act. And the truth is that, I mean, the international community is very slow in the prevention of crisis. But, I mean, this is not new, but I think it became particularly serious in the recent past.
And Central African Republic we haven't touched on, but obviously that was really in the news for a while, and now it's not. Is that solved? Is it fixed?
No, and more. In the Central African Republic, this is not the first crisis. Yeah. This is the worst crisis. Yeah. But in a previous crisis, the Special Representative of the Secretary General made an appeal of $20 million for the disarmament and reintegration of militias. And that appeal was completely forgotten. And the result is now to be seen. I mean, the truth is that the prevention first, it avoids suffering.
More than half the population needs humanitarian assistance.
It avoids instability, and it's much, even for those that are selfish, it's much cheaper. To prevent is much cheaper than to then address the dramatic consequences of a conflict that erupts.
Why don't governments get it? I mean, in a world where money talks, why don't people get the fact that it's much cheaper to prevent than to deal with the overspill?
I mean, the only answer I can give you is a cynical one. It's because CNN is not there to cover prevention. and the other networks are not there to cover prevention, but they are there to cover the conflict.
So it's our fault.
And no, it's not the fault of the media. No. It's the fact that political systems and political responsibles tend to go responding to things that are brought to the media instead of having policies that are directed to really avoid and solve the problems.
If I might say, given the fact that we're having this lecture, you know, in memory of Sergio and of what makes good leadership, essentially, is what we're talking about. I have actually always been frustrated in this short-termism. You know, that, you know, if you don't see it, you don't deal with it. I remember when the Bosnia war ended and President Clinton said that there would be troops deployed, US troops with NATO. And I remember he said that they would be for 6 months only, and I'm thinking to myself, 6 months? But of course it was 6 months, and then 6 months, until 14 years later they were still there. But the politicians don't have, or at least they don't think they have the courage or the political will to make long-term policies.
I think that, we have to, in my opinion, two serious problems, and not only in democratic systems. I think that even non-democratic systems tend to have the same problems, even if they have others that are much worse. One problem is that the relationship between the political establishment and the people in general, or the public opinion, has deteriorated quite substantially. The confidence of the people in the political institutions in most of democratic countries has deteriorated quite substantially. And this is a serious problem. And there is no easy answer. I mean, it's because communication now is much easier. Probably also because it's more difficult for people to protect their intimacy, and so less people are ready to become politicians in the present situation. But there are many reasons. But the truth is that there is this gap of confidence that, in my opinion, affects the decision-making capacity of a democracy.
People suffer.
And then the second problem is that, I mean, the frantic development of political life, in which if something appears at news at 7, needs to be solved before news at 8 p.m. And the rhythm is such that the long term becomes 1 week, the medium term becomes 1 day, and the short term becomes 1 hour. And the strategic dimension is lost. And then, of course, with so many elections and the polls, and always looking at the polls and seeing, I mean, the capacity of politicians to lead the process has been replaced by politicians following or trying to catch up with what's happening in society. And the truth is that you see the popularity, very few leaders, with very few exceptions, after 6 months it comes down very quickly.
It's fascinating insight, especially from a politician.
To the serious, substantial problems of society.
And I think it's fascinating insight, especially for some of the young people here who may want to go into public service or government. It's really important insight that. Are there any other students here who want to ask a question? I saw you with the tie first, and then you, the lady behind, afterwards.
I'd like to thank you all.
Question.
The question goes for both commissioners. With the rise of the crisis in the Middle East, if we solve the problem, how could we ensure the effective reintegration of refugees into local communities and the development of human rights with the new regimes in an effective manner?
Okay, I think that's a great question. And added to that, you know, the UNHCR was designed to help people go back to their countries, not to forever have them in camps around the world.
I think that there is a key question here, which is the need for solutions and for sustainable solutions. And there is a gap. Madame Ogata, that was my predecessor some time ago when Sergio was in UNHCR, already was speaking about the gap between relief and development. And the truth is that if one looks at today's budgets, humanitarian budgets in the world are about 1/8 of development cooperation budgets. And the questions you raised are typically questions that need to be addressed from the perspective of development cooperation, creating the conditions for communities to be rebuilt and to be sustainable. And for that you need to bring development actors very early in the process of a crisis. And we are not yet there. And worse than that, sometimes humanitarians are asked to themselves get involved in those activities in the absence of development actors. I think it is absolutely essential to have in the priorities established for development cooperation policies two kinds of things. One is solutions for people displaced when they go back, internally displaced or refugees, and the second is to support those communities affected by displacement or by conflict. Look at Lebanon and Jordan today. Because they are considered to be middle-income countries, they cannot receive grants from the World Bank. This is totally absurd. Wow. I think that development cooperation policy should be reviewed to take into account the possibility to give a priority to those countries that are not only the first line of reception of the victims of these conflicts, but that are also the first line of defense of collective security in today's world.
Did you have anything to add?
Yes, no, it's a very good question. In fact, it was so good, I'm worried that you're going after my job. It is, and you didn't deny it either. The rights that are attached to an individual, many of them are inalienable, and much of it now is codified in international human rights law. The standards are there, the laws are there. Countries need to just observe them and realize that they have obligations in respect of all individuals, whether they're nationals or those under their control. So I think the approach has to always be human rights sensitive. The second point that I wish to make is I can perhaps share in the intimacy of this room a family story. My father was for about 5 years stateless. His family was dispossessed of their home. He was living with his mother and mother and father, my grandfather and grandmother, in Europe, and he had nowhere to go until he was invited to go to Jordan. And he created a family there, and my brothers, my sister and I were born there. There isn't a day that passes without him being grateful for what Jordan did for him. At his weakest, when he was dispossessed of his family, his friends, his sense of identity, a home welcomed him. And he's never forgotten that. And I think that is the lesson in terms of how we look at refugees. And forgive me for intruding on your turf. But if you treat them well, when they are most desperate, when they are most weak, they will be the most loyal citizens of your country. If, conversely, you treat them with ill respect, you treat them poorly, shabbily, they could then be a source of tension and alienation and problems that emerge later on. So very much it depends on how countries first treat them. And if they treat them through a human rights sensitive lens and respecting international refugee law, for instance, and international human rights law, then good things can happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi, Commissioner Zeid. My concern, you have spoken out on behalf of victims who have been harmed by UN peacekeeping personnel, civilians who have been harmed by UN peacekeeping personnel. I am concerned that the UN's leadership on human rights is being undermined by its efforts to evade accountability for the cholera outbreak in Haiti. And I'm wondering, what steps can your office take to ensure that the UN respects the cholera victims' human right to a remedy?
Yeah, it's another excellent question. When I first spoke to the Human Rights Council back in September, I said we in the UN have to be humble. There are many aspects of our work which we have to be extremely proud about. Great achievements have been registered by the UN. Much of the work can be inconspicuous, not obvious, but it's good work. There have been shameful episodes. I mean, take the abuses by UN peacekeepers, which I had to observe and report on about 10 years ago. Alas, that has still not gone away. We still have reports of that happening. And so how can I go and tell countries and remind them of their obligations if we in the UN family still have this form of abuse? Of course, it demands of us to be a bit more humble. I have met with representatives and victims of the cholera outbreak, and the Secretary General was also in Haiti and spoke about the issue. And I will continue to listen, and of course, you know, what they've gone through is appalling. At the moment, though, this case is under litigation, and so really we can't go into it in any depth because it's being litigated in the courts. But I think the point is well taken, and the point is that we need to be humble about what it is we're saying.
Why is it that after 10 years since you first addressed this issue, that it's still going on? Why is there no zero-tolerance policy? Why is there no meaningful, accountability?
Well, it's a good question, Christiane. I think what people have to understand is that the most severe penalty the UN can implement is a dismissal from service. Now, if someone has committed rape and is a UN staff member, the most that the UN can do is just say, thank you, go home, and you're out of a job. The question then arises, well, what needs to happen? Well, the country where the crime took place ordinarily should mount an investigation and conduct a prosecution. But if the country is broken, I mean, most of these peacekeepers are operating in parts of the world where there is no judiciary. So then you have to look at the country of origin. And in many countries, when it comes to the civilian side, they can't assert their jurisdiction over their nationals in other places. And so effectively the person has impunity. Will go home, dismissed from service by the UN, won't be employed by the UN, but essentially they are not sort of subject to prosecution on the civilian side. On the
can the law change in that regard?
It can. There is a draft convention in the General Assembly, but it's been stuck for 6 years, and it hasn't moved an inch. And
who's blocking it?
All the member states are responsible, all of them. And so we can't be serious about tackling this issue if there's no decisive action on the part of member states to solve it. So I know it's a bit shocking.
It's very shocking. Down there? Yes, you with your hand up, with the thing on your ear? Yep.
Hello. Thank you for this opportunity. My question is kind of going to your earlier question with regards to handing off, I guess, the task to development and humanitarian agencies. And Christiane, Ms. Amanpour addressed the changing nature of publicity of different conflicts. When something is out of vogue or not chic to support or to donate to or to be covered by the media, what is left of the UNHCR or the OHCHR's work there? When the media passes, do you pass that off to development agencies, or do you do other, less conspicuous, as you said, or lower profile work to build the capacity for a community to develop? Thank you.
Well, in what regards us, we have no choice. Our mandate is very clear. Wherever there is a refugee problem, we need to be there. Now, how do we manage to be there when there is no funding for that operation? What we did was to reform internally the organization, to reduce the structural costs, to allow for the unearmarked funding we receive to be applied in those situations that last, that go on and on and on, like Somalis, like Darfurians, etc., that go on and on and on, and completely disappeared. In the case of the Darfurians in Chad, they completely disappeared from the attentions of the international community. But the truth is that the resources we have are extremely limited compared with the needs. We are there, we will be there until refugees are there and need our support. Sometimes it's very difficult to make countries accept their local integration, or to create the conditions for them to go back, but we will not abandon them. Unfortunately, we have very little capacity to do what we would like to do, which is to fully guarantee their protection needs and their basic needs in a way that we would be happy with. But at least we do our best to preserve their dignity and to cater for their most essential needs. But that is a dramatic problem. I'll give you an example. 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, everybody was talking about Blue Nile and South Kordofan. Now, there are 200,000 refugees from Blue Nile and South Kordofan in South Sudan. They are there in an unimaginable situation because of the crisis in South Sudan. Last year, we have spent $56 million of unearmarked money to be able to respond to the needs of these populations, because they were completely forgotten by the donor community, for a simple reason. Now the fashionable is the crisis in South Sudan. It's no longer the crisis of South Kordofan and Blue Nile, but they are there with the same needs, with the same problems. This is a very serious question, and to be honest, the humanitarian community as a whole today is financially broke. If you look at the recent decisions that the World Food Programme was forced to take, for instance, reducing by 40% the food security support in the Syria crisis, in the dramatic situation of the Syria crisis, you will understand that with the huge increase in needs and the fact that there is no identical increase in financial support, the humanitarian response capacity today in the world is already insufficient.
I'll give you just the figures. The Syria crisis appeals, only 57% funded in last year, 2014, compared to 71% funded the year before. So as needs go up, the delivery gets less.
Yeah, can I gripe as well?
Yeah.
Because if he's broke, I'm 10 times more broke than he is. It's true. It's true. That's true. As we
You're going to have to find some
kickstarting,
some crowdfunding, some good campaigns.
We need to. As we say, we stop shaking hands like this and we shake hands like this now only. No, look, there is something obscene.
That could be a good commercial.
Maybe join me. There's something obscene in this world when you look at the financial services industry and see how much money can be leveraged for capital projects around the world. You know, hedge funds, private equity firms, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. They have so much liquidity, they just don't know where to put it almost. And on the other side, we are absolutely desperate for monies to run our field offices, to train police, to teach people how to interrogate without torturing, to make people realize that they have rights. I mean, it's so obscenely lopsided.
But surely you can see a pool of funds. It's your job to try to get them. And I say that not facetiously because, as you know, there are umpteen really very, very good charity events. There's Robin Hood in New York. There used to be ARC in London. Hedge fund-led. Millions and millions of dollars and pounds raised for good works. Perhaps, I mean, is there no way you can partner with these kind of people? That's one question. And then the other question is, there are mountains of food going to waste every single day in our societies, from homes, from restaurants, from, you know, good food, not bad food, good food that's going to waste. Is there no way to harness this supply to the demand?
On accessing that money, you're making an offer to help. So I'm going to take you up on this offer.
I didn't hear that.
Everybody heard you. Everybody heard you, Christian.
I might broadcast it. But...
Everybody heard you. So we are delighted to announce that CNN is going to be a partner.
I just got fired.
I beat you to it. Buddy.
No. I mean, we are making a huge effort to have support from the private sector. And we have increased tenfold the support we get from the private sector. The problem is that that is a drop in the ocean compared with public aid.
Yes.
If you consider the OECD countries, because there are other sources of funding, the OECD countries have humanitarian budgets that altogether represent about $22 billion per year. Development cooperation money without humanitarian aid is 180 billion per year. So we are talking about 8 times more. Now, if there would be a much better connection between humanitarian action and development action, we would be able to address these present gaps. But the problem is that we are still not there.
And another thing, apparently polls show that most citizens believe that their governments give much more than they actually do to aid, and when they're asked how much they should give, they say a really hefty percentage. I mean, the United States, for instance, I believe, pays less than 1% in aid and all the rest of it. When people are asked, they think the US is paying 25%, and when they're asked, well, how much do you think they should pay? Well, 15% or something. They're only paying 1%. So is there a name and shame kind of situation you could do? Is there a campaign there you could do to get countries to scale up their aid budgets?
Well, we publish that data, and everybody knows who gives us whatever. The question is that the humanitarian budgets, indeed, have always been treated like a residual thing in public debate. And that is what I think today, when we see that these humanitarian problems are also linked to crises, and that those crises became serious threats to global security. My hope is that countries will understand that humanitarian problems need to be addressed with a much higher priority.
We have about 15 minutes left before Laurent, I believe.
You asked about the waste.
Yes, the waste.
I think it's not only food. I mean, the levels of waste in our societies are gigantic. I think one of the things that it would be very important to mobilize the civil society is exactly to find ways to find logistic solutions, because it's not easy, to allow for many of the levels of waste to be used in a positive way.
Yes, I mean, I say this partly because of the fact, but partly because WFP is constantly making appeals that it's running short and can't deal. In any event, as I said, we've got 15 minutes before we're going to wrap this up. I want a few more of the students. You, sir, with your hand up, I just saw you there. Yep.
Thank you, Christiane. I watch you every evening. And to the commissioners, thank you for speaking so authentically on these issues with refreshing insights. My question is, to your point, Commissioner for Refugees, you say there's an important to have a link between humanitarian goals and development goals. And to both of you, really, how important do you feel it is to see your work reflected in the post-2015 development agenda as specific standalone goals? And then outside of your roles as commissioners, what goals would you like to see in the 2015 development agenda, not necessarily related to human rights or refugees? Thank you.
Question. No, it's a good question. Wow. No, of course, for us, unless development is undertaken with a human rights sort of approach, or let's say through a sensitive, human rights sensitive lens, often we believe that it could end up for naught. And it's a very complex sort of operation, this, that it's not just a question of building a school, for instance, and having desks and having a blackboard and having books in the corner. It's a question of whether real education is taking place. It's not a question of having a post office that is staffed with men and women who are civil servants, who are there and give you the appearance of a postal service, a public service that works, but it's a real service that's offered to the people of the country. And the main point is that it's governments that have to serve the people and not the other way around, as so many politicians seem to think it is. And so development, unless it's focused on the rights of the individual, whether it be economic or social or political or civil, they're not all mutually exclusive. We believe that all of these rights have to be honored. It can often lead to a block. One point also I think that is important is that in so many conflict areas, the remedy is not just throwing cement at the problem. It's not just rebuilding. It's also working on the memory issues, the narratives, the deep scarring in the sort of the mental tapestry of the country. and the need to reconcile all of that. If you just think that you can solve these problems by building bridges and building a police station and training a few people, you are sadly mistaken. It doesn't work like that. It can, but you're gambling. In most cases, it doesn't, and you need to penetrate the deeper wounds of a society, the history. We used to hear in the Balkans, and it's something that Sergio would have said time and again, because a lot of our friends and colleagues would say in the Balkans, but it could be applied in many other parts of the world, that people forgot nothing and learned nothing. And I think this is ultimately the source of many crises.
What if people admit nothing? Let's take Russia, which does not admit it's active in Ukraine. Let's take Burma, where the Rohingyas don't even get the time of day. I mean, they can't even get called what they are. People think of them as less than human. How do you deal with governments who don't even admit there may be an issue to discuss?
Well, you can look at it in both ways. I mean, most countries have a very severe difficulty in looking at their own past through a clear lens. Very few can do it. And if most can't look back at the events that happened 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and agree on a narrative that all parts of a community will sign on to, then you can see why it is that different interpretations today will exist. Because we can't settle things that happened 100 years ago. I'll give you an example. When last year, when I was in my old job and I presided over a discussion on this very theme in the UN Security Council, we were told that certain things were taboo. The First World War could not be discussed in the UN Security Council. It was still sort of too fresh.
Even though we were celebrating or commemorating the 100 years?
Yes.
The Security Council didn't commemorate 100 years of the First World War.
Well, it didn't want a discussion on it. We couldn't have a discussion on it. Yeah.
So do you think MH17 is too fresh? Is anybody going to be held accountable for that?
This is the thing. Certainly we need to have accountability that anchors the sort of pockets of truth on which then historians and people who understand history will have to sort of knit this together. But I think thinking of resolving conflicts simply by throwing cement at the problem is not enough, as we know.
We're going to get another... Yes, ma'am, right there. You? Green scarf?
Sorry, I don't have a microphone.
Okay.
My name is Vieira, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute. I was wondering, I had a question for High Commissioner Zeid, and my question refers to UN Security Council Resolution 817, 1993, on the naming of the Republic of Macedonia as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And I was wondering how you could you comment on your former role at the UN Security Council and today your role as a High Commissioner for Human Rights and at the Human Rights Council. How do you, what can be done for resolutions such as that one, which break certain violations and certain human rights of people?
Okay.
For example, so the right to self-determination, which is common Article 1 of both covenants.
Okay.
So the right of the Macedonians to call themselves Macedonians.
That's another very good question.
It's a good question, and I was looking at the clock and I thought we only have 10 minutes to go.
You have 6 minutes, but you can't take 6 minutes on this. In 1 minute or less? In
1 minute or less. Well, I can say that while I was on the Security Council, we didn't specifically deal with this particular problem. And it's clear that it was a subject of mediation exercises, I think, undertaken by the European Union predominantly to resolve this issue of the name between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. It is a subject on which there has been lots of discussion, of course, but in terms of my own experience, it's not something. But you raise a very important point, and that is this business of right to identity, and I think it's something we need a deep discussion on.
If I may make a comment on these two questions, I think that there is no way to fully solve a problem if there is, namely, a conflict, if there is not a real reconciliation. And to have a real reconciliation, you need to bring the truth. The problem is, and I fully agree with this, but the problem is that in my experience now, speaking of my past political experience, it's extremely difficult to make people agree about the past. It's sometimes relatively easy to make people agree about the future, but to make people agree about the past, even if it is discussing only facts, it's sometimes extremely difficult.
Do you think, though, that a South African-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission could be translated and scaled to a lot of the other areas in the world, or was that just specific to that one place?
I think it should, but again, there was a leadership that was absolutely essential. And the question is to find similar leadership in other situations of conflict. And Nelson Mandela was indeed, in my opinion, crucial to make it happen, and to make it happen in a positive way.
You in the front there, yep.
Thanks. My name is Chibueze Victor Odemba. I'm a student of European University. I'm from Nigeria. I just have an open question. With the corporate sector growing even larger than state, in some examples like Yahoo bigger than Mongolia in terms of GDP and revenue, and McDonald's bigger than Latvia, my question is what role do you think the corporate sector has to play in the international system towards peace and security?
Good question. No, it's an excellent question. I mean, it was interesting to note that as the Ebola crisis began and the UN system was crying out for funds, that of course a number of large multinational companies that are very present in those countries, that have signed multi-billion-dollar contracts, and you would have thought that they have a stake in the security of the human security of these nations. And I would have thought that aside from their social corporate responsibility clauses, that they would have stepped up and they would have said, we've made huge investments. These investments now are irrelevant. People are dying because of Ebola. It could threaten the rest of the world. We have to pitch in and help. And I didn't see that happen unless there was evidence that I didn't come across. But clearly there is, I believe, a role for the redress of some of these crises in the form of just helping us, because we can't do it with the monies that we have available.
And I think it's fair to say that several private sector institutions, both companies and foundations, have played a very important role. I mean,
That's right.
The Gates Foundation, and for instance, we have in UNHCR support from the several companies that help us address technical problems that we wouldn't be able to address with our own expertise. So there is a growing attention by the private sector to forms of using corporate social responsibility to link it to problems of development and humanitarian aid. But this question is also present. Many of the problems we have in the world, many of the conflicts we have in the world, develop because of economic interests in which sometimes large corporations are involved. For instance, all the questions related to the DRC and coltan, which nobody talks about. It's a good example about how private interests sometimes also contribute to the emergence and worsening of conflicts.
So we've come to the end of our Q&A section. I want to thank the audience, but I want to ask you guys to have the last word in the spirit of the evening and the theme of the evening. What makes you happy? What made you go from Prime Minister to refugees? And what would you say to the young people about leadership? And then the same question to you.
To be honest, what makes me more happy is when I visit resettled refugees that are able, we are supporting about 100,000 people to resettle every year. So it's meaningful, even if the number of refugees is much higher. And you go to a country like Canada or the United States or Sweden or Australia, and you see someone that was living in Dadaab camp for 17 years and without any chance. You have in Dadaab people that are born from parents that were born in Dadaab. And all of a sudden you go and in the streets of Chicago or Montreal, and I'm quoting examples, to see them with a small shop that is theirs, with a normal life, their children in school, their health care completely. I mean, That is fantastic. And also, in the other side, when you see people go back home, sometimes in situations of still extreme poverty, but after 10, 15, 20 years in exile, and I've seen that in several parts of the world, namely in Liberia, we're talking about, to go back home and to go back to their villages, to see members of family they haven't seen for decades. I mean, that is fantastic. Unfortunately, we see that we are less and less able to provide solutions for a growing number of people affected by displacement.
And you, from a royal life to, frankly, the service of human rights. It's somewhat counterintuitive for your part of the world, I might say. What is it that gives you the oomph to keep going and to keep challenging people, including in your own part of the world? And what would you communicate about leadership to the young people here today?
I think you're saying that I'm quite odd, basically. But very diplomatically.
Nice odd.
Nice odd. But, no, I think what gives all the colleagues that work with me, and I have a terrific office and hugely dedicated staff, and many have been exposed to considerable dangers in the field and still are, is the realization that human rights defenders around the world are under pressure in so many corners of the planet. And yet they're willing to forfeit almost everything in the service of a principle or a human right. And you think, if these people are willing to go to jail, perhaps even for decades, forfeiting their family, forfeiting their freedom, because they believe that this is the right thing, then who are we to sit and complain and indulge in the luxury of moaning and whining about this? So I think they give you huge courage, and I think I can speak on behalf of all my colleagues in the office. And it is difficult, because we live in an environment, for instance, we didn't talk about this, where civil society or grassroots sort of activism is under real threat, both from the extremists, but even more so from governments who seek to counter the violence of the extremists by limiting the space for civil society. And ironically, it is civil society that provides the best antibody to extremism. And yet governments are overplaying their hand and in fact playing into the arms of extremists. In that environment, you have incredibly courageous human rights defenders, and I think they give you the courage. And I think, Sergio was very much affected by this. When you look at what he was saying at the time, I think he initially was skeptical about taking up the role that I have now. He was very much a humanitarian at heart, and then dealing with all these brilliant lawyers. He was a bit uncomfortable in the beginning, but I think he understood just how motivated one can be by the courage of the people you work with.
Well, Commissioners, High Commissioners, thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating, informative, frank, and funny and sad as well. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. And I'd like now to call up Vieira de Mello to close the proceedings and to say a few final words.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation, I would like to sincerely thank Mr. António Guterres and Mr. Zeid Hussein for sharing with us their deep experience of the world conflicts. It was very interesting and very lively. Thank you.
Thank you.
A warm thank you as well, of course, to Mrs. Christiane Amanpour for having found time in her busy schedule to be here tonight and moderate the debate. I would also like to thank the United Nations here in Geneva for welcoming us in this impressive assembly hall and for supporting us over the years. And last but not least, thank you to the Graduate Institute, our partner tonight for this event. I'm sure you all have appreciated tonight's insight on how to handle global crisis, and will all agree with Sergio, my dad, when he was promoting dialogue as a preeminent way to restore peace. Thank you all and have a great evening.